The archive room in the lower levels of the Royal Sovereign Court was a place where sound went to die. Cold stone walls absorbed every echo, leaving only the faint, rhythmic scratch of a steel-nibbed quill against thick parchment. Avery Vance sat at the edge of a massive oak desk, her ink-stained fingers wrapped tightly around the feather shaft. The temperature had dropped steadily since sunset, leaving frost on the narrow window panes. The midwinter gala was taking place somewhere far above her, but down here there was only the scent of dry ink, aged leather, and biting northern wind. It was a role that demanded absolute invisibility. The high lords of the court rarely paid attention to a low-ranking clerk, leaving her perfectly positioned among the dusty records they deemed too tedious to read themselves. She preferred the company of bound volumes to the chaotic hierarchies of the pack. Tonight, she had been tasked with a standard audit of the Southern Territory trade agreements, a job passed down by Chancellor Julian Sterling. Avery blew a thin layer of grey dust off the cover of the final ledger. She opened the heavy leather binding, her cracked knuckles stretching against the cold. The entries were written in standard imperial script, but as she ran her finger down the column of grain exports, her thumb caught on a subtle indentation in the parchment. It was a secondary cipher, pressed into the paper without ink, visible only when the candlelight struck it at a severe angle. She reached for her brass translation compass, aligning the hidden indentations with the old merchant codes. As the letters formed words, the scratching of her quill slowed, then stopped completely. The air in her lungs seemed to freeze. This was not a tax ledger. It was a direct correspondence between Julian and the foreign privateers occupying the coastal borders. The translated text detailed a coordinated plan to allow the privateer fleet through the southern blockade in exchange for unregistered silver and military support to unseat the current Alpha lineage. It was treason, calculated and meticulously funded, stamped with the Chancellor's personal cipher. Avery let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, filling every crack. She did not gasp. She had spent enough of her life learning not to show emotion in front of people who would use it against her. The sterling correspondence lay flat against the oak desk, its iron gall ink suddenly looking less like a record of trade and more like a warrant for execution. The dates aligned perfectly with the upcoming shift in the Royal Guard deployment. Julian had built an entire shadow economy within the margins of the state's official documents, assuming her low rank equated to intellectual blindness. Avery carefully wiped the tip of her quill on a linen cloth, her breathing shallow and controlled. The chill was grounding. It kept her mind sharp. The immediate problem was the physical reality of the evidence. The decoded translation and the original cipher pages had to be removed from the archive. Avery stood up, her wooden chair scraping softly against the stone. She wore a simple, dark green linen gown, belted at the waist with a wide velvet sash. With precise, unhurried movements, she folded the thick parchment of the sterling correspondence. The paper was stiff, resisting the crease, the dry crackle, sounding deafening in the silent room. Unlacing the side of her velvet sash, she slid the folded documents into the inner silk lining, pressing them flat against the stiff boning of her corset. The physical mechanics of the concealment were unforgiving. If she moved too quickly, the parchment would rustle against the silk. If she breathed too deeply, the stiff edges would dig into her ribs, drawing the eye of any trained guard. Avery spent a long moment simply calibrating her breath. She had to walk with absolute stillness in her torso, letting her legs absorb the motion. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. She blew out the candle and stepped out into the corridor. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her. The hallway was lined with flickering tallow torches, the distant music of the gala growing louder as she navigated the servant passages. She needed to reach the outer courtyard and send the documents directly to the royal fortress. But as Avery rounded the corner toward the eastern stairwell, her steps faltered. The heavy iron-wrought gates, which normally stood open for the estate staff, were pulled shut. Standing before them were two of the Chancellor's personal guards in deep crimson cloaks. They were actively checking the faces and satchels of every footman attempting to leave the wing. Avery stepped back into the shadows of a stone archway, her heart maintaining a steady, calculating rhythm. She watched a kitchen boy empty his pockets onto the floor under aggressive scrutiny. Julian had realized his mistake. The Chancellor knew the ledger was in the archive, and he was sealing the exits, the parchment pressed sharply against Avery's lower ribs. The outer gates were impossible. The servant passages were compromised. The only exit remaining that would not immediately subject her to a physical search was the Grand Solarium itself. The heart of the Gala, crowded with hundreds of high-ranking nobles and the royal court. To escape the wolves guarding the door, she would have to walk directly into the center of the pack. She adjusted her velvet sash one final time, flattening the edge of the hidden letters. Her knuckles were white, but her expression was perfectly blank. She turned away from the eastern stairwell and began the long ascent up the marble steps toward the music, the light, and the dangerous geometry of the ballroom. The vast ballroom was a sensory assault of spun glass, heavy perfumes, and the sharp tang of hot beeswax dripping from thousands of suspended candles. Avery moved through the gilded archway, her spine perfectly straight. She kept her chin parallel to the marble floor, a physical manifestation of her invisibility. In this room of high-ranking wolves, an estate translator was nothing more than a piece of moving furniture. She used that to her advantage, sliding through the edges of the crowd, where the shadows were longest and the laughter was loudest. But the architecture of the Gala had changed since she had entered the archives hours ago. At the eastern and western exits, Chancellor Julian's personal guards had formed a tight perimeter. Avery stopped beside a massive marble pillar, letting a group of laughing countesses pass in front of her. She observed the guards with the detached precision of a ledger keeper checking columns of numbers. They were not looking for an assassin. They were conducting systematic searches, specifically pulling aside the low-tier staff, the servers, the junior scribes, the musicians. A guard in green livery grabbed a passing maid by the elbow, pulling her abruptly toward the cold stone wall. Avery did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had a safety net. Instead, she began to count. She watched the guard take the maid's small woolen satchel, dump the contents onto a silver tray, and run his hands roughly over the pockets of her linen apron. The entire process took exactly 32 seconds. The maid was shoved away, weeping quietly, and the guard immediately flagged down a young archivist carrying a stack of music sheets. Another 35 seconds. Avery calculated the geometry of the room. There were 3 guards working the eastern wall, moving inward toward the terrace. Between her current position and the closest guard, there were exactly 7 low-ranking servants carrying trays of wine and plates of roast pheasant. At an average of 35 seconds per search, factoring in the time it took to pull someone from the crowd, Avery had less than 4 minutes before a heavy hand closed over her shoulder. 4 minutes until they found the sterling correspondence. The stiff parchment lay hidden against her ribs, pressing into her skin beneath the lining of her velvet sash. The decoded letters felt heavier than iron. They detailed the Chancellor's privateer shipments, the treasonous gold moving across the borders, and the forged royal seals. If the guards patted down her waist, the unnatural rigidity of the papers would be discovered instantly. She took a slow, measured breath, drawing the scent of ozone and spilled wine into her lungs. She could not run. A sudden sprint would trigger the predatory instincts of every wolf in the room, turning her into a hunt. She had to walk. She had to find a blind spot in the guards' sweeping pattern and slip through the terrace doors before the 4 minutes expired. Avery calculated the angle of the chandeliers, noting where the bright amber light failed to reach the edges of the room. The terrace doors were 20 yards away, draped in heavy crimson velvet. She began to move, charting a path behind a cluster of loud, drunken diplomats. Every step was measured. She kept her hands clasped loosely in front of her, the perfect picture of an obedient, bored clerk waiting for a master's order. She had crossed half the distance when the crowd suddenly parted, and the cold draft of the winter night hit her face. Before she could reach the brass handle of the terrace door, 2 figures stepped out from the alcove, blocking her path entirely. Lord Corin Finch held a crystal goblet of wine, his pale eyes tracking her with uncomfortable intensity. Beside him stood Silas Mercer, a man whose loyalty to Duke Baines was matched only by his cruelty toward those who could not fight back. They were not guards, but they were deeply embedded in the conspiracy. Avery stopped immediately, lowering her gaze to their polished boots, projecting the subservience expected of her station. "An estate translator," Corin murmured, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl that barely carried over the string quartet. "Wandering so close to the open air. The archives are in the lower levels, are they not? You seem to have lost your way." "I was instructed to fetch a fresh ledger for the Master of Ceremonies, my lord," Avery answered. Her voice was flat, devoid of a single tremor. She kept her eyes fixed on the silver embroidery of Corin's waistcoat, refusing to meet his gaze. It was the correct answer, boring and administrative. She took a half-step backward, intending to pivot toward the northern gallery, calculating that she still had 2 minutes before the guards reached her quadrant. Silas did not speak, but he moved with the sudden, fluid grace of a predator closing a trap. He shifted his weight, closing the distance between them in a single stride. Avery braced herself for a physical grab, ready to twist her wrist away, but Silas did not touch her arms. Instead, he brought his heavy, steel-toed boot down squarely onto the trailing hem of her velvet skirt. The fabric pulled tight against her waist. Avery froze. It was a calculated, invisible violation. To the rest of the crowded room, they looked like 3 people having a polite, hushed conversation near the curtains. Silas's hands remained perfectly relaxed by his sides, holding his own drink, but Avery was physically anchored to the marble floor. If she took another step, the aged velvet of her gown would rip loudly. The sound of tearing fabric would instantly draw the attention of the entire room, including the Chancellor's guards, who were now only a dozen yards away. "You are in a terrible hurry, little clerk," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, mocking whisper. He leaned in, the smell of sour wine and cedar washing over her face. "The Chancellor is very interested in the papers missing from his private desk. He believes a rat might have crawled into the records room." Avery's knuckles tightened against her own palms. The sterling correspondence dug into her ribs, a physical reminder of the execution warrant she carried. She could not pull away. She could not speak without escalating the confrontation. The music swelled, a bright and frantic waltz, but beneath it, Avery heard the heavy footsteps of the guards moving closer, checking the next row of servants. Her 4 minutes were evaporating, and she was pinned to the stone. The geometry of her entrapment shifted from a mere inconvenience into a definitive blockade. A third shadow fell over the polished marble floor, eclipsing the ambient amber light of the ballroom chandeliers. Duke Richard Baines stepped into the narrow space between the potted winter ferns and the stone balustrade, effectively closing the final gap. He moved with the heavy, unhurried arrogance of a man who owned the very ground he walked upon, his broad shoulders in their dark crimson doublet shutting out any view of the swirling dancers in the main hall. Avery Vance did not step back. To retreat meant hitting the freezing glass of the terrace doors, a physical admission of being cornered. Richard carried a heavy silver goblet in his right hand, the metal sweating from the intense heat of the liquid. The ambient noise of the grand gala, the sweeping violins, the clatter of crystal, seemed to muffle behind the physical wall these three men presented. Lord Caesalus and Lord Corin shifted to either side of the Duke, forming an unbroken crescent. Avery kept her chin level, adjusting her focus to the gold embroidery on Richard's collar, rather than meeting his predatory stare. She occupied the quiet space, while they attempted to fill it with intimidation. "A rather long walk from the lower stacks, Miss Vance," Richard murmured, his voice a low, gravelly drawl designed to project authority without breaking the polite veneer of the party. He leaned forward, closing the distance until the heat radiating from his large frame breached the cold draught of the terrace. He lifted the silver goblet and exhaled deliberately. The bitter steam of his heavily spiced wine blew directly across Avery's face. It smelled sharply of boiled cloves, cinnamon bark, and the distinct, metallic tang of warm alcohol. The hot moisture stung her eyes, a calculated invasion of her immediate sensory space meant to force a flinch, a cough, or a backward step. Avery held her ground. She did not blink. She let the bitter vapor dissipate against the cold air of the glass behind her, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make Silas shift uncomfortably. "The Chancellor is missing a particular set of archive keys," Richard continued, swirling the dark liquid in his cup. The metal rings on his fingers clicked sharply against the silver goblet, and a rather sensitive ledger from the Eastern Provincial Records. "Our guards note that you were the last scribe to log out of the High Archives this evening. A diligent worker, perhaps too diligent." Avery controlled the exact cadence of her breathing. She inhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill the top of her lungs without expanding her lower ribs, where the heavy parchment of the decrypted diplomatic letters lay hidden. "I catalogued the agricultural tax yields, Your Grace," she answered, her voice smooth, hollow, and perfectly pitched to the register of an obedient, low-ranking clerk. The keys were left on the Master Archivist's desk, as dictated by the sovereign protocols. "If Chancellor Julian has misplaced his personal records, I cannot assist him." Richard's eyes narrowed, the polite facade cracking just enough to reveal the cruelty beneath. He knew exactly what was missing. The three lords exchanged a look, communicating through the silent, hierarchical micro-expressions of men accustomed to breaking the weak. Corin took a half-step closer, his gaze dropping slowly from Avery's composed, face down the length of her simple attire. In a room overflowing with imported silks and jeweled bodices, her dark linen dress was a stark anomaly, but it was the thick, midnight blue velvet sash wrapping tightly around her waist that drew the minor lord's attention. It was too rigid for a simple decorative garment, holding its structure with a stiffness that betrayed the layers concealed within. "A heavy choice of fabric for a dancing hall?" Corin noted, his tone dripping with false curiosity. "Velvet and linen. And yet you stand stiff as a board. One might think you were carrying the weight of the kingdom around your waist." Avery felt the sudden, terrifying spike of adrenaline, a cold needle of pure survival instinct piercing the base of her spine. She did not allow the shock to reach her face. The sterling correspondence, the decoded letters proving the treasonous alliance, pressed against her ribcage, the dried iron gall ink practically burning through the fabric. Richard followed Corin's gaze, the predatory realization blooming in his dark eyes. The Duke handed his silver goblet to Silas without looking, freeing both of his hands. He stepped into Avery's immediate perimeter. "The Sovereign Court takes the theft of archive materials very seriously. As loyal servants of the Crown, it is our duty to conduct an official search of any suspicious individuals." Hand over the sash. It was an extortion veiled as protocol. The demand hung in the cold air, thick with the threat of public humiliation. They were banking on the fact that a low-born estate translator would rather surrender her garments quietly in the shadows than cause a screaming scene in the middle of a royal gala. They knew no guard would cross three high-ranking nobles to defend a clerk. Avery tightly clasped her own hands behind her back. She locked her fingers together, digging her short, unpainted nails deep into the soft flesh of her palms. It was a brutal, necessary physical anchor. Every survival instinct screamed at her to reach forward, to cover her waist, to protect the hidden parchment. But to touch the velvet sash now would be a definitive confession. It would guide their hands directly to the prize. The physical strain of keeping her arms rigidly locked behind her back sent a sharp ache up her shoulders. It was a punishing stance, but she refused to let her posture break under their scrutiny. The courtyard outside seemed to echo the grinding of her teeth, her jaw locked so tightly it sent a headache radiating through her temples. "I will not strip in the shadows of a ballroom for you, my lord," Avery said, her voice dropping into a quiet, deadly register. Not a plea, not a panicked refusal. It was a statement of absolute, immovable boundary. Richard smiled, a slow, ugly curving of his lips that promised violence. "You misunderstand your position, little scribe. You do not have a choice." He raised a heavy, gloved hand, reaching directly for the knot of the velvet sash at her hip. The music from the main hall swelled, a sweeping waltz designed to mask the quiet cruelties of the court. Avery did not close her eyes, watching his hand approach, calculating the exact moment she would have to strike a noble of the realm. The great arched entrances to the grand chamber were sealed tight against the midwinter storm, muffled beneath heavy layers of crimson velvet meant to keep the brutal northern wind at bay. For hours, the vast chamber had been a suffocating cage of heat, gold leaf, and forced merriment. Then, without a preliminary announcement from the heralds, without the ceremonial striking of a staff, the massive brass handles turned. The heavy oak doors did not merely open, they were pushed back with a slow, deliberate force that groaned through the ancient iron hinges, a sound that cut cleanly through the chatter of 100 scheming nobles. A sudden, biting draught of freezing rain swept into the stifling heat of the ballroom. It carried the sharp metallic scent of ozone and the deep, resinous burn of amber rolling in from the dark courtyard. The cold air sliced effortlessly through the cloying clouds of lavender water, roasted meats, and melting beeswax that had hung stagnant in the air all evening, dropping the temperature of the room in an instant. Alpha King Valerius Kalen stepped over the threshold. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The impact of his arrival was measured first in the immediate, physical faltering of the orchestra on the raised balcony. A cellist dragged his bow too hard across the strings, producing a discordant, jarring scrape that echoed terribly in the high ceilings. The flutists lowered their instruments mid-note, their breath catching sharply in their throats as they stared downward. One by one, the violins bled away into nothing, their strings muted by trembling fingers, until the sweeping waltz evaporated completely. The resulting silence was not the kind that fell naturally between spoken words. It was the heavy, suffocating kind that swallowed them whole. Valerius moved with the unhurried, devastating grace of a sovereign, who governed not by brute pack dominance, but by absolute, terrifying legal authority. His heavy leather boots cracked against the polished marble floorboards with a measured, inescapable rhythm. Step, step, step. Each impact drove the air from the lungs of the assembled nobility, demanding compliance without a single command being issued. He wore his formal ceremonial coat, the deep black velvet lined with silver wolf fur hanging from his broad shoulders like a heavy shroud over the glittering, superficial finery of the court. He wore no decorative medals, no jeweled pins, only the cold weight of his office. His presence altered the fundamental atmospheric pressure of the chamber. The lords and ladies nearest the entrance immediately stepped backward, lowering their chins, dropping their gazes to the floorboards. They parted silently, folding away from him like dark water breaking against the iron prow of a warship. No one spoke. No one dared to raise a glass to their lips. The only sounds remaining in the vast, gilded cage were the distant drumming of the winter rain against the terrace glass and the steady, rhythmic approach of the king's boots. The scent of ozone thickened in the room, an olfactory promise of the storm he had brought inside with him. Valerius paused halfway across the dance floor, his posture completely relaxed, yet radiating a suppressed lethal tension that made the hairs on the back of every neck stand on end. He did not look at the high-ranking ministers bowing near the dais. He did not acknowledge the frantic, nervous curtsies of the Chancellor's inner circle. Instead, his pale, piercing eyes began a slow, systematic sweep of the room's architecture. He was searching for the anomaly. He was reading the room the way a master tactician reads a battlefield map, looking for the disruption in the natural flow of the crowd, the hidden geometries of threat. His gaze passed over the empty center of the floor, skipped past the musicians' gallery, and settled entirely on the dark alcove near the eastern terrace. The crowd had unconsciously given that specific corner a wide berth, leaving Avery isolated and surrounded by the Chancellor's operatives. The tension in that shadowed alcove was a physical weight, thick and undeniable. Valerius's eyes locked onto the structural imbalance of the scene. 3 high-ranking lords crowding a single low-status estate translator against the cold glass of the terrace doors. Silas Mercer stood closest to her. In his arrogance, the minor lord had pressed forward, his polished leather boot planted firmly over the lower hem of Avery's modest linen dress. It was a calculated, quiet act of physical entrapment, pinning the fabric to the stone floor so she could not step backward into the rain-slicked shadows of the balcony to escape their interrogation. Behind him, Richard Baines and Corin Finch stood with their shoulders squared, forming a solid wall of velvet and malice. Avery had not looked down at the boot. She had simply held her ground, her posture straight, her spine rigid against the glass. Her fingers rested lightly, almost casually, over the velvet sash where the translated cipher lay hidden. She survived by noticing the details others missed, and she noticed the exact second the Alpha King found them. She did not allow relief to soften her features. She only let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. Valerius did not growl. He did not shout a command across the silent hall, nor did he reach for the weapon at his side. He simply stood perfectly still in the center of the vast floor, his gaze fixed entirely on Silas's face. The distance between them was vast, spanning the entire width of the marble dance floor, yet the weight of the sovereign's stare hit the minor lord like a physical blow. Silas blinked, his mocking sneer faltering. He tracked the direction of the suffocating silence, turning his head slowly toward the center of the room. When he realized exactly who was looking at him, all the manufactured bravado drained from his flushed cheeks, leaving behind an ashen, sickly gray. Beside him, Richard and Corin stiffened, their hands dropping limply to their sides as their political courage evaporated. The king did not blink. He merely shifted his chin a fraction of an inch downward. His eyes dropped briefly to the polished boot resting on Avery's dress, held there for 3 agonizing seconds, before rising back to meet Silas's terrified stare. It was not a request. It was an execution order, deferred by mere seconds. Silas's breath hitched audibly in the quiet. His hands began to tremble, the dark red wine in his goblet sloshing frantically against the gold rim. Slowly, with agonizing caution, he slid his foot backward, pulling it completely off the hem of the simple linen gown. He shrank back, trying to fold his shoulders inward, silently submitting to the unspoken authority radiating from the center of the room. The fabric of Avery's dress settled back into place, the trapped linen finally smoothing out against the cold stone. Avery allowed herself one shallow, controlled breath. The iron trap closing around her had suddenly released its grip, not through frantic violence, but through the terrifying restraint of the king. She kept her hands steady against her sash, waiting as Valerius resumed his deliberate path across the marble. The silence in the gilded ballroom did not break. It thickened, pressing against the eardrums of every noble in attendance, until the quiet became a physical weight. Valerius finally halted before them, a man who owned the very air he displaced. He did not look at Avery first. His gaze, dark and absolute, locked onto the three men surrounding her. Richard Baines froze, the smug superiority draining from his features, like water drawn into dry earth. Corrin Finch and Silas Mercer took an involuntary half-step backward, their shoulders dropping as the Alpha King's oppressive aura pressed down on the physical space around them. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, Chancellor Julian Sterling stood near the tiered fountain, his wine glass suspended halfway to his mouth. Avery watched the Chancellor's jaw tighten from the corner of her eye, a microscopic fracture in his usually immaculate composure. The mastermind of the privateer conspiracy could not intervene. No one could. The hierarchy of the court was absolute, and the sovereign had just claimed the territory of this shadowed corner. Valerius closed the final distance, his heavy boots making no sound on the polished marble. The heat radiating from his large frame was a sudden, violent contrast to the biting winter draft leaking through the terrace doors. When he spoke, his voice did not echo off the high glass ceilings. It was a low, gravel-textured drawl, pitched exclusively for the perimeter of violence tightening around Avery. "Dance with me or I'll lose my patience." The words were not a command directed at her. They were a razor-thin warning directed entirely at the men obstructing his path. Avery understood the geometry of his posture instantly. He had angled his broad shoulders to create a physical barrier between her and Richard. The Alpha King's lethal irritation was entirely weaponized as a tactical shield. To the rest of the room, it sounded like the arrogant demand of a bored sovereign interrupting a minor dispute. But to Avery, observing the precise calculation in his stance, it was a deliberate extraction protocol. He did not bare his teeth. He did not growl. He simply extended his hand toward her, palm open, fingers steady. The gesture was striking in its restraint. While his eyes promised immediate, devastating violence to anyone who dared to close the circle again, his offered hand was completely safe. It was an invitation, requiring her consent, even as his presence demanded the retreat of her enemies. Richard swallowed hard, his throat bobbing above his stiff embroidered collar. He bowed hastily, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, utterly unable to meet the king's gaze. Silas and Corrin followed suit, practically tripping over their own velvet cloaks as they scrambled to clear the path. The oppressive cage of their proximity vanished, replaced by the sheer, overwhelming gravity of the sovereign. Avery looked at the open hand suspended in the space between them. The gold signet ring on his index finger caught the amber light of the chandeliers, a heavy seal of authority offered as a lifeline. She did not hesitate. As she placed her fingers against his, Valerius adjusted his grip, taking her wrist gently but firmly. The physical contact was a profound shock to her system. She had spent the last hour consumed by the icy terror of discovery, her blood running cold beneath her corset, her palms slick with the dread of the gallows. His touch was the exact opposite. His hand was warm, overwhelmingly solid, and incredibly steady. It was not the bruising grip of a conqueror claiming a prize. It was the grounded, measured hold of a protector anchoring a survivor in the aftermath of a storm. He did not pull her off balance. Instead, he waited for her to step forward on her own power, guiding her past the frozen statues of the minor lords and out into the blinding light of the ballroom floor. As they stepped into the center of the solarium, the suffocating tension in the room finally snapped. A frantic, unspoken command rippled through the gallery above. The musicians, realizing the king was standing in the center of the marble floor, waiting for a tempo, scrambled for their instruments. A violist nearly dropped his bow in his haste, the sharp clatter of wood echoing against the glass panes. Within seconds, the hesitant, sweeping notes of a midwinter waltz filled the vaulted ceiling, the melody unsteady at first before finding its proper, flowing rhythm. Avery felt the sudden, terrifying exposure of 1,000 eyes turning toward them. The entire court was watching the lowest-ranking estate translator being led into the geometric heart of the Gala by the sovereign himself. Yet, the exposure did not feel like danger. Valerius's massive frame blocked out the sightlines of the Chancellor's guards. The heavy velvet of his ceremonial coat brushed against the silk of her gown, creating a micro-environment of deep cedar, ozone, and unyielding safety. He stepped into the first measure of the waltz, his movements impossibly smooth for a man of his size. Avery followed, her muscle memory taking over as she let him guide her into the rotation. The icy knot of panic in her chest began to thaw, replaced by a sharp, highly focused tactical awareness. She was no longer a cornered prey animal, praying for an exit. She was standing in the most visible, untouchable sanctuary in the kingdom. The heat of his hand on her waist was a silent promise that the rules of the court had just fundamentally changed, and she was the only one who knew the true stakes of the game they were about to play. The musicians adjusted their posture, drawing horsehair bows across gut strings to establish a heavy, measured cadence. The waltz demanded a formal count of 3, a rigid geometry that dictated exactly where a partner's foot must land on the polished marble. Avery let herself be guided into the initial sweeping turn, her thin leather shoes catching the rhythm with practiced, invisible efficiency. She did not look at the sovereign's face. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the silver embroidery, tracing the lapel of his ceremonial coat. Calculating the acoustic properties of the massive hall, the chamber was a massive echo chamber of high-vaulted glass, gilded mirrors and stone pillars, laughter, the rustle of heavy silk and the deep, driving resonance of the cellos created a chaotic, overlapping layer of noise. Avery realized instantly that the continuous movement of the dance provided a flawless acoustic shield. Whenever they rotated toward the center of the hall, the sheer volume of the surrounding crowd would swallow any sound she made. She waited for the precise moment. As the music swelled, the cellos hitting a low commanding note, she leaned slightly forward. 3 manifestos, she murmured, her voice pitched to the exact frequency of the gliding fabric around them. Dated the 4th, the 9th, and the 12th of the winter quarter. Valerius did not break stride. He did not tighten his grip or offer a dramatic questioning reaction. His hand remained a steady, impersonal anchor on her waist, guiding her through a reverse pivot. His focus was directed outward, his pale eyes tracking the perimeter of the room, with the cold calculation of a territorial commander mapping a hostile border. Julian Sterling, Avery continued, speaking only on the outward beats when they spun away from the edges of the floor, has been stamping counterfeit imperial seals on the northern grain shipments. He is routing the surplus directly to foreign privateers anchored in the Grey Straits. The sovereign executed a smooth, sweeping box step in response. The motion carried them past a cluster of minor nobility, their gossiping faces blurring into a mosaic of pearls and velvet. The waltz was traditionally designed to display power, a framework of steps meant to showcase the hierarchy of the court. Avery used it as a metronome for survival. Every time the heavy bass note struck, they turned, and every time they turned, she delivered another piece of the puzzle. The ledger entries are recorded in standard trade ink, she whispered rapidly, syncing her breathing to the rise and fall of the melody. But the true cargo weights are written in the margins using an iron gall cipher. I translated the shorthand this evening. The Chancellor is using pack resources to fund an external fleet. Valerius turned her again, his footwork impeccably silent, despite the heavy boots he wore. The physical distance between them remained entirely proper, strictly adhering to the dictates of court protocol. He was not pulling her into an intimate embrace. He was providing a mobile fortress. Where is the cipher key? His voice was barely a vibration against the ambient noise of the hall, a low, resonant hum that did not carry beyond the span of their immediate space. "Soon into the inner lining of my sash," she answered, letting the momentum of the dance carry her backward while her spine remained perfectly straight. along with the decrypted correspondence. If they search me at the doors, the ink will stain my hands and provide physical proof of possession. Valerius absorbed the tactical intelligence without missing a single beat of the waltz. He was treating the conversation as a battlefield briefing, prioritizing the extraction of data over the theatrics of the gala. Avery felt the tight knot at the base of her spine finally uncoil, the slow exhale of air leaving her lungs. She was not a decorative prop being paraded for the court's amusement. She was a state archivist, delivering critical espionage to the highest authority in the territory, and he was receiving it with the exact level of seriousness the treason warranted. The hostile men who had cornered her moments earlier, Richard Baines, Corin Finch, and Silas Mercer, were still stationed near the terrace doors. They had not abandoned their pursuit. Though forced to retreat by the king's sudden arrival, their eyes remained fixed on the moving couple, their hands resting stiffly near their belts. Avery knew they were waiting for the music to stop, anticipating the moment the sovereign would discard her so they could resume their aggressive interrogation regarding the stolen archive materials. Valerius noted their positions without turning his head. His ceremonial coat was crafted from thick, midnight blue velvet, lined with heavy wolf pelt at the collar and shoulders. It was a garment designed for brutal northern winters, giving his already broad frame a massive, imposing silhouette. As they danced, the king began to alter the standard geometry of the promenade. He did not follow the traditional circular path that would expose his partner to all sides of the room equally. Instead, he mapped the sightlines of the men watching them when they rotated toward the terrace. Valerius dropped his left shoulder by a fraction of an inch and brought his right arm forward, allowing the sweep of his heavy cloak to flare out. The thick velvet created a literal, moving wall between Avery's midsection and the hostile observers. He was deliberately plunging her waistline into a deep, impenetrable physical shadow. Avery felt the sudden shift in the lighting. The harsh, amber glare of the crystal chandeliers was completely blocked by the sovereign's torso, effectively masking her from the perimeter. She recognized the brilliance of the maneuver instantly. In a crowded, brightly lit ballroom, the eye is naturally drawn to faces, shoulders, and the sweeping hems of gowns. By subtly angling his body and utilizing the sheer volume of his winter coat, Valerius made it impossible for anyone to clearly see the velvet sash. The physical sensation of this protection was distinct, operating not as a heavy-handed display of dominance, but as a quiet, tactical obscuration. The thick fabric brushed against her skirt, carrying the faint, crisp scent of frost and cold iron. He stepped directly into the path of Richard's gaze. The Duke shifted his stance, trying to peer around the moving obstruction, but Valerius simply adjusted his stride. He commanded the spatial geometry of the floor so completely that Baines was forced to step backward into the crowd to avoid being trampled by the sweeping couples desperately parting for their king. Avery kept her expression perfectly placid, betraying nothing of the state secrets she carried. Every step they took was calculated, transforming a beautiful court dance into a deceptive cover. Avery kept her gaze fixed on the intricate gold embroidery mapping the lapel of Valerius's doublet. She could not afford to look down. She could not afford to track the movement of his right hand as it rested low on her waist, precisely over the velvet sash where the treasonous letters were concealed. The Chancellor's men were still lingering at the periphery of the marble floor, their eyes tracking the king's heavy ceremonial coat, searching for any break in his posture. He did not give them one. The Alpha King moved with a slow, predatory fluidity, turning his partner in a wide arc that positioned his massive shoulders between her and the hostile minor lords. The chandeliers overhead cast fractured amber light across the dancing couples, but Valerius purposefully guided her through the deepest shadows cast by the grand archways. His left hand held hers with a steady, unyielding pressure, grounding her racing pulse in the physical reality of his strength. In his right hand, resting against the curve of her spine, the sovereign made a marginal, calculated shift in his grip. The young translator felt the cold, undeniable weight of silver pressing through the heavy fabric of her dress. He wore the obsidian ring blade, a sovereign artifact rarely seen outside the high tribunal chambers. The heavy silver band housed a micro-thin edge of volcanic glass, a tool designed for severing diplomatic wax seals, sharp enough to cut leather without a sound. She felt the hidden mechanism slide open against her spine, with a faint metallic click, a sound completely swallowed by the ambient noise of the crowded floor. "Keep your eyes on my collar," the monarch murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration that barely reached her ears over the music. His expression remained terrifyingly blank, the perfect, unreadable mask of a bored ruler enduring a compulsory social duty. Avery obeyed, her posture locking into rigid, flawless perfection. She braced her abdominal muscles, steadying her breathing, anticipating the cut. The cello section of the royal orchestra swelled, pulling a long, dragging downbow that vibrated through the floorboards and up through the thin soles of her slippers. In that exact fraction of a second, he angled his hand. The microblade bit into the velvet sash. The clerk did not flinch, though the razor-sharp edge passed mere millimeters from the linen of her undercorset. She focused entirely on the strict, numerical rhythm of the waltz, stepping backward on the next count, allowing him to pull the blade smoothly across the concealed seam. The soft, precise hiss of silk tearing was entirely masked by the deep, mournful vibration of the kellos. It was an extraction performed with surgical, cold efficiency, requiring absolute physical synchronization under the intense, suspicious scrutiny of 100 hostile nobles. He did not rush. A hurried movement would have snagged the delicate lining or caught the attention of Lord Corin, who was still glaring from the dark terrace doors. Instead, the king allowed the natural, sweeping rotation of the dance to do the work. As they spun toward the eastern gallery, sweeping past a massive pillar of black marble, he finished the incision. The hidden inner pocket of her sash was now laid completely open, exposing the stiff, folded parchment hidden within. With the lining severed, Valerius did not hesitate. His long-gloved fingers slipped seamlessly inside the ruined velvet, tracing the edges of the hidden documents. Avery felt the immediate friction of the thick, iron gall ink parchment sliding against the fine silk of her garments. The sterling correspondence, the decoded letters detailing Chancellor Julian's illegal alliance with foreign privateers, was a heavy, rigid bundle. It had bruised her ribs all evening, a constant physical reminder of the execution that awaited her if she were caught. Now he was taking it from her. The king extracted the thick fold of letters with a deft, singular motion, using the momentum of a sharp pivot on the dance floor to mask the shift of his arm. The estate translator felt the sudden, shocking absence of the paper. A rush of cold, ambient air slipped through the torn seam of her sash, brushing against her waist. She felt instantly lighter, the suffocating physical weight of the treasonous evidence vanishing in a single breath. The relief was not merely psychological. It was a profound sensory shift. Her torso could move freely again, no longer restricted by the stiff parchment binding her movements. Without breaking the solemn cadence of the waltz, the monarch guided the documents upward beneath the protective cover of his massive velvet coat. With a practiced economy of motion, he slid the decoded correspondence into the deep inner pocket of his own doublet, securing the letters against his chest. The irony of the moment settled over Avery with absolute, undeniable clarity. The most dangerous, incriminating evidence in the entire kingdom was no longer hidden on a vulnerable, low-ranking clerk. It was now resting against the heart of the sovereign himself, shielded by an authority that no minor lord or corrupt chancellor would ever dare to question, let alone search. His hand returned to her waist, the grip warm and steady against the torn fabric of her dress. "It is done," he said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the heads of the crowd, ensuring no one had noticed the transfer. She let that knowledge anchor her, slow, thorough, filling every crack of her previous panic. The young woman had spent the last hour maintaining strict, motionless composure, preparing to be cornered, searched, and inevitably condemned by men who viewed her as nothing more than an expendable target. But here, locked in the center of the glittering hall, the geometry of power had completely inverted. The men tracking her were now staring at a woman who held absolutely nothing illegal, dancing with a sovereign who held the very instrument of their destruction. She allowed her rigid, aching shoulders to drop a fraction of an inch, finally leaning into the physical support of his frame. He easily absorbed her shifting weight, adjusting his stride to accommodate her sudden exhaustion. The danger was not over. The Chancellor still commanded the outer guards, and the gates remained locked, but the immediate, lethal threat of discovery had been neutralized. They continued to turn beneath the amber light of the chandeliers, a perfectly executed performance of courtly indifference, while the undeniable proof of systemic treason rode safely inside the king's coat. The waltz began its final sequence, the music swelling into a grand, sweeping cadence that demanded the attention of every noble in the room. The sovereign used the collective distraction, executing a sharp, perfectly balanced turn that carried them out of the chandelier's golden glare and into the cooler, dimmer periphery of the sweeping chamber. The temperature shift was immediate. The oppressive heat of hundreds of bodies, heavy perfumes, and burning beeswax gave way to the bracing draft of the eastern gallery. Valerius did not stop moving. His massive frame continued to shield her, his steps precise, forcing her backward until her spine brushed the heavy velvet drapery, separating the ballroom from the outer corridors. "The third movement is ending," Valerius murmured, his voice pitched so low it was entirely consumed by the scrape of boots on marble behind them. His tone held the calm, measured cadence of a commander who had already mapped the battlefield. "You will slip through the service door behind this curtain. Do not look back at the room. Do not run. A sudden sprint draws the eye." Avery kept her chin lifted, fixing her gaze on the gold embroidery of his collar rather than the daunting breadth of his shoulders. She committed his instructions to memory the way she memorized archive indices, categorizing and securing. "Walk as though I have been dismissed," she replied softly, her breathing steady despite the pressure mounting in her chest. "Walk as though you belong exactly where you are going," he corrected, the rumble of his chest vibrating against her knuckles. "The guards at the perimeter are searching for a frightened woman carrying stolen documents. You are neither frightened, nor are you carrying anything but your own dignity." He was right. The weight of the sterling correspondence was gone from her sash, leaving her physically lighter, but politically anchored to the most dangerous man in the territory. She felt the absence of the heavy parchment against her ribs, a hollow space that paradoxically made it easier to breathe. The terrifying reality of what she had done was replaced by the terrifying reality of what he was about to do. "Where am I going?" she asked. "To the royal fortress," Valerius answered. "Through the old servant passages. The Chancellor's men do not know the architecture of the lower keep. They rely on the main gates, on brute force, on the paths meant for gentlemen." The final chord of the waltz struck. The room erupted into polite, gloved applause. Valerius stopped. The dance was over. The physical proximity that had shielded her was now required to end by the strict geometry of court etiquette. Avery prepared for the abrupt withdrawal of his warmth, bracing herself for the sudden exposure of standing alone on a hostile floor. Instead, as Valerius lowered his arm, he did not immediately let her go. His calloused hand slid down the length of her arm until his fingers found hers. For a single, suspended second, he tightened his grip. It was not a possessive demand. It was a brief, unmistakable squeeze of deep reassurance, a physical tether anchoring her to his protection. The warmth of his palm transferred into her icy fingers, steadying the fine tremor she had fought to hide all evening. "I will handle the Chancellor," Valerius said, his eyes locking onto hers with quiet certainty. "Go." He released her hand. The heat remained in her skin, acting as a strange, invisible armor. Avery took one step backward, slipping entirely behind the heavy crimson drapery, letting the noise of the ballroom wash away into muffled insignificance. The eastern gallery was a stark contrast to the grand hall. Here there were no crystal chandeliers, only iron sconces spaced far apart, casting long overlapping shadows against the bare stone walls. The air smelled of damp earth, old pine, and the faint, metallic tang of armor polish. Avery stood in the dim corridor, taking a single, measured breath to recalibrate her senses. Before she could take her first step toward the servants' stairwell, a shadow detached itself from the alcove to her right. Avery's heart slammed against her ribs. She froze, her posture automatically straightening into the rigid stance of a clerk awaiting judgment. "Hold your silence," a gruff, low voice commanded. The figure stepped into the weak pool of candlelight. It was not one of Julian's sycophants. It was Hector Cole, the captain of the king's personal guard. He wore the dark, unornamented leather armor of the royal vanguard, a stark departure from the gilded uniforms of the Chancellor's men. His weathered face was a mask of absolute, functional efficiency. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the singular focus of a soldier executing a direct sovereign order. "Captain," Avery breathed, forcing her muscles to uncoil. Hector did not waste time with formal greetings. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator who understood the value of silence. From over his arm, he unfurled a heavy, dark woolen cloak. It was a plain traveller's mantle, the kind worn by night watchmen, smelling faintly of cedar and cold mist. "Put this on," Hector instructed, stepping forward to drape the heavy material over her shoulders. "Your gown catches the light. You might as well be carrying a lantern." Avery pulled the cloak tightly around herself. The heavy fabric immediately smothered the bright, metallic sheen of her velvet sash and the embroidered silk of her bodice. The thick wool weighed heavily on her collarbones, a physical burden that simultaneously provided immense relief. Under the dark mantle, she was no longer an exposed target. She was an anonymous shape in the night. "The king was precise in his orders," Hector said, pulling the deep hood over her head and effectively masking her features in shadow. "We are bypassing the courtyard entirely. The Chancellor's hounds are checking every carriage that attempts to leave the main gates. We will take the sub-level passage to the outer ring." Avery fastened the iron clasp at her throat, the cold metal biting into her fingers. "The sub-level passage is flooded in the winter months." Hector offered a grim, approving nod, clearly registering her administrative knowledge of the estate's infrastructure. "Which is why the guards will not be watching it. The water is freezing, and the path is narrow, but it leads directly to a secure transport." He paused, his gaze dropping to her thin satin dancing slippers. "It will not be a pleasant walk." "I am not accustomed to pleasant walks, Captain," Avery replied, her voice stripped of any ballroom pretense. She was an archivist, a woman who had spent years navigating the cold, neglected corners of the keep. A flooded tunnel was merely another damp corridor, far less dangerous than the smiling lords who had cornered her near the terrace. "Good," Hector said, turning his broad back to her and gesturing toward the narrow stairwell, plunging into the dark beneath the gallery. "Stay close, step where I step. If we encounter a patrol, you do not speak, you do not explain yourself, Yell. You become a shadow on the wall." Avery nodded from beneath her hood, her hands tightening their grip on the heavy wool. The scent of dry ink and treason was now thoroughly masked by the smell of wet stone and rough cedar. She fell into step behind the captain, leaving the golden trap of the grand solarium far above them. The transition from the velvet-draped gallery to the utilitarian stone corridors was immediate, marked by a sharp drop in temperature and the sudden absence of beeswax candlelight. Hector did not speak, nor did he look back to check if she was keeping up. His pace was demanding, his heavy boots rolling heel to toe in a practiced military silence that defied the sheer weight of his armor. Avery followed a half-step behind his right shoulder, her posture strictly upright, refusing to let the residual adrenaline make her movements frantic or clumsy. The air in this lower level smelled of damp limestone, old iron grates, and biting winter drafts, a stark and clarifying contrast to the oppressive amber musk and suffocating perfume of the Grand Solarium. They encountered 3 separate patrols of the Outer Estate Watch in the span of 5 minutes. Each time, the soldiers turned at the sound of approach, their hands resting lazily on their swords, only to stiffen and avert their eyes the moment they recognized the imposing figure of the captain of the Royal Vanguard. Hector did not offer a salute, a nod, or a single word of explanation for his presence in the servants' wing. His absolute authority required no justification. Avery utilized his massive, broad-shouldered silhouette as a physical blind spot, keeping her face angled downward and letting the deep shadows of the corridor obscure her features. Not a single guard questioned the quiet clerk trailing in his wake. At the far end of the passage, a heavy oak door opened directly into the northern courtyard. The midwinter storm had settled into a relentless, freezing rain that washed the stone pavers in a layer of icy, reflective black water. Hector pushed the iron-banded door wider, reaching for a heavy, dark wool guard's cloak that had been left resting on a peg by the exit. He held it out to her in silent offering. Avery took the garment without hesitation, swinging the rough, unlined fabric over her shoulders to cover the ruined silk of her sash and the thin fabric of her evening gown. They stepped out into the bitter wind. The courtyard was a treacherous expanse of uneven, historic cobblestones and deep, freezing puddles that caught the faint, distorted light of the carriage lanterns waiting by the perimeter gates. Avery's thin Gala shoes were completely unsuited for the harsh northern weather. The delicate leather soles offered absolutely no insulation against the biting chill of the stone, and the silk ribbons tying them to her ankles soaked through within seconds. She calculated her steps with meticulous precision, her eyes tracking the raised edges of the dry stones, deliberately avoiding the pooling water that threatened to compromise her footing. She did not rush, nor did she complain about the biting cold sinking into her bones. She simply measured the physical distance to the iron gates and executed the crossing with the same quiet, methodological endurance she applied to untangling dense diplomatic ciphers. The freezing rain plastered stray strands of dark hair against her cheeks, but she ignored the physical discomfort, keeping her focus entirely on the mechanics of moving forward under the captain's silent, unyielding protection. Beyond the heavy iron gates stood a dark, unmarked carriage, its lanterns shuttered to narrow slits of amber light, drawn by a pair of massive northern draft horses that stood completely still in the freezing rain. Hector pulled open the heavy wooden door, the hinges well-oiled and silent. Avery climbed the iron step, her frozen fingers gripping the brass handle, and pulled herself into the shadowed interior. Before she could offer a word of acknowledgement, Hector shut the door with a solid, echoing thud, sealing her inside the dark cabin. He did not join her. A moment later, she felt the carriage shift as the driver took his place on the bench, and the horses stepped forward into the muddy road. The interior of the cabin was entirely devoid of royal crests or plush velvet. It was a tactical transport vehicle, smelling strongly of old saddle leather, beeswax polish, and the damp wool of her borrowed cloak. Avery settled onto the bench, reaching up with shaking, stiff fingers to pull the wet fabric tightly around her shoulders. Now that the immediate necessity of movement had ceased, the physical toll of the night began to register. She closed her eyes and exhaled a long-held, trembling breath against the carriage's cold leather interior. Letting the tension slowly uncoil from her spine, the silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic, muffled drumming of the rain against the wooden roof and the steady crunch of wheels rolling over wet gravel. As the carriage navigated the winding descent away from the estate, the distant, faint strains of the string quartet playing the waltz in the grand solarium gradually faded into nothing. The grand illusion of the midwinter gala was entirely gone, replaced by the profound, solitary quiet of the winter night. Avery kept her hands folded carefully in her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped the edges of the heavy cloak. She did not allow herself to collapse against the seat. Instead, she leaned her head back against the wood-panelled wall, processing the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. She had walked onto the dance floor, a cornered, low-ranking estate translator, entirely at the mercy of arrogant lords who viewed her as disposable prey. She was leaving it under the direct armed protection of the monarch, having successfully transferred the sterling correspondence required to dismantle a corrupt dynasty. The documents were no longer burning a hole in her sash. They were safely secured against Valerius's chest, protected by a sovereign authority that no chancellor could overrule. The cold air seeping through the carriage floorboards grounded her, transforming the residual fear in her chest into a sharp, clear certainty. The carriage accelerated toward the royal fortress, and for the first time in years, the quiet darkness felt like a sanctuary rather than a hiding place. Back in the main ballroom, the sweeping waltz continued, entirely ignorant of the void left by the king's vanished partner. Valerius Calen stood alone near the eastern gallery. He did not look toward the corridor where Avery had disappeared. He turned slowly to face the center of the chamber. "Stop the music! Seal the hall!" His deep command carried through the cavernous space with the weight of cold iron. The response was absolute. The conductor's baton froze. Cellos groaned to a discordant halt. Dancers stumbled, heavy silk sweeping the marble as couples broke apart. The ambient chatter of the nobility faltered into a stifling quiet. Every face turned toward the king. At the perimeter, the sovereign's elite guard moved with terrifying precision, instantly bypassing the chancellor's sentries. The massive oak doors swung shut on forged steel hinges. A heavy, metallic scrape echoed against the vaulted ceiling. The definitive clatter of thick iron bars sliding into reinforced brackets. The main exits were barricaded. The king had turned the grandest room in the palace into a locked cage. Panic wove through the crowd. In the center, Julian Sterling stiffened. The dark wine in his crystal goblet spilled over his thumb. The chancellor's meticulously cultivated mask slipped. He had orchestrated the cornering of a low-ranking clerk. He had not anticipated becoming the trapped animal himself. A few paces behind him, Richard Baines and Corin Finch exchanged a terrified glance. Silas Mercer instinctively stepped backward, but the space around him was already emptying. "Your Majesty," Julian called out, modulating his voice to project calm authority. "Is there a threat to the court?" "My personal guard can secure the perimeter if the fortress has been breached." Valerius did not answer immediately. He occupied silence without the nervous impulse to fill it. The king walked down the marble steps in a measured cadence, functioning like a ticking clock. The assembled nobility parted instantly, scrambling backward. His dominance was entirely structural, rooted in the absolute certainty of his right to rule. The sovereign stopped 10 paces from the chancellor. Deliberately, Valerius reached into his dark velvet doublet and withdrew a folded stack of parchment. The pages were dense with the angular strokes of iron gall ink. Julian's eyes locked onto the pages, his skin draining to the shade of old ash. He recognized the cipher patterns and the red wax seals meticulously translated by a clerk he had dismissed as invisible. It was the sterling correspondence. Valerius unfolded the top ledger sheet. Treaty violation. Article 4, Section 9 of the Sovereign Code, he read, his voice cutting through the stillness with administrative absolute. The unauthorized diversion of winter grain shipments to foreign privateer vessels, specifically rerouting the merchant galleons scheduled for northern famine relief to the black markets of the Salt Coast. A collective murmur rippled through the nobility. Stealing famine relief was a direct insult to every pack elder. Julian opened his mouth to issue a denial, but Valerius continued with the unyielding rhythm of an executioner's blade. To be compensated by, Valerius paused, tracing the decoded numbers, 3 chests of unminted silver per shipment. Routed through the lower merchant guilds under the false registry of textile imports, the transactions were stamped, verified, and signed by the Chancellor of the High Archives. "That is a forgery," Julian interrupted, desperate, a fabrication designed to destabilize the crown. Valerius stated flatly, "And the mathematics are exceptionally detailed. You sold the security of the eastern border for a fraction of its worth. On the 14th of the winter moon, you authorized the withdrawal of our outer guard to allow safe passage for the privateer fleet." Valerius looked up, his gaze devoid of heat. It was the empty stare of a predator assessing a dead thing. "You did not merely commit treason, Julian. You committed it cheaply. For 50,000 pieces of silver, you left the sovereign pack vulnerable to a shoreline invasion." Valerius let the number echo against the cold stone. "A pathetic sum. You sold the blood of your own people for enough coin to buy a dozen tapestries for your estate. The surrounding lords and ladies understood the math perfectly. Selling out the pack's borders for pocket silver was a grubby, shameful betrayal. They physically recoiled, leaving Julian isolated in an expanding circle of empty marble. Even Silas turned his back. Julian's chest heaved. He shot a frantic glance toward his personal sentries, but the men remained frozen before the king's heavily armed elite guard. He needed a distraction. "This is an illegal tribunal," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "You have no secondary witness. A stack of forged letters pulled from a low-born clerk's pocket does not constitute legal proof. She is a nobody, a rat in the archives who barely knows how to read a proper ledger. The sovereign archivist has already verified the cipher," Valerius replied smoothly, deliberately elevating Avery's title to a permanent royal rank before the entire court. He folded the correspondence and slid it back into his coat. "The evidence is absolute, and the tribunal is concluded." The echo of the sovereign's voice faded, leaving a silence so absolute it felt as though the oxygen had been violently pulled from the stifling room. The decrypted words of the sterling correspondence hung in the amber light. An undeniable anchor of treason dropped directly into the center of the midwinter gala. For 3 agonizing seconds, no one moved. The surrounding nobles, dripping in heavy silk and gold leaf, remained frozen, their breaths caught painfully in their throats, terrified that a single twitch might mark them as conspirators. Julian Sterling's face drained of its customary color, his practiced aristocratic mask shattering under the crushing weight of documented truth. He took a half-step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked courtyard gates, calculating a geometry of escape that no longer existed. The iron gall ink on the parchment in the king's hand was a death sentence. In a desperate, wordless command, born of pure panic, the Chancellor flicked his wrist toward his personal guards, stationed along the velvet-draped walls. The response was jagged and deeply uncertain. A dozen men in the Chancellor's dark green livery hesitated, their conditioned loyalty to their master, fighting a losing war against the terrifying reality of drawing steel in the physical presence of the sovereign. Then, the grinding, metallic scrape of swords being pulled from leather scabbards sliced through the quiet room. It was a foolish, frantic sound echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. Valerius Kalen did not flinch. He did not shift his broad stance, nor did he reach for the obsidian ring blade or the heavy broadsword resting at his hip. He simply lowered the parchment, his expression carved from cold northern stone, and waited for the trap to close. Before Julian's men could even raise their blades to a defensive posture, the heavy oak doors of the eastern gallery swung violently inward. Captain Hector Cole strode into the light, his grim, scarred face entirely devoid of surprise. Having secured the quiet estate translator safely in the outer perimeter carriage, the veteran commander had returned with the full, unyielding force of Valerius's personal guard. They poured into the ballroom like a rising tide of cold iron. Dozens of sovereign guards, clad in dark, unpolished armor, moved in perfect, terrifying synchronization. There were no shouted orders, no chaotic battle cries to shatter the Gothic solemnity of the hall. They simply flowed around the Chancellor's men, lowering heavy iron halberds and leveling steel-tipped crossbows until every one of Julian's guards found a wall of royal weaponry pressed mere inches from their throats. The rebellion lasted less than 10 seconds. It was a suffocating display of tactical superiority, a testament to a court ruled by discipline rather than brute aggression. The Chancellor's guards, realizing they were completely outmatched and outmaneuvered by the royal forces, began dropping their weapons in rapid succession. Julian stood trembling in the center of the tightening circle of iron, his vast authority, built painstakingly on forged treaties and foreign privateer gold, evaporated into the sharp scent of ozone and terrified sweat. Knowing his political empire was irreparably broken, his fingers went numb. His ceremonial broadsword slipped from his lifeless grip. It fell, clattering loudly onto the polished marble floor. The heavy steel slid across the smooth stone with a grating, high-pitched screech, finally coming to rest exactly at the toe of Valerius's polished leather boot. The king stared down at the discarded blade, offering it nothing but quiet, absolute disdain. With the primary threat entirely neutralized, Hector gestured sharply to his waiting lieutenants. The sovereign guards began moving deliberately through the stunned crowd, their heavy, armor-clad boots thudding rhythmically against the floorboards. The aristocratic audience parted instinctively, pulling their expensive gowns and fur-lined velvet cloaks away from the armored men, desperate to avoid the fatal contagion of treason. The guards bypassed the weeping duchesses and the trembling minor barons, moving with absolute, mechanical precision toward the outer terrace. They did not need to guess who to apprehend. The decrypted pages Valerius held contained a highly specific, undeniable ledger of names. Richard. Baines realized. They were coming for him before the guards even reached the perimeter of the dance floor. The arrogant noble, who had commanded the court's outer gates with such heavy-handed cruelty only an hour before, now found himself completely isolated. His personal sycophants and hangers-on scrambled backward into the shadows, leaving him standing alone by a towering marble pillar. When a sovereign guard clamped a massive, gauntleted hand onto his shoulder, Richard did not attempt to fight. The sudden collapse of his systemic arrogance was painted clearly on his chest. His head bowed in suffocating silence, the physical posture of a man whose ancient lineage could no longer shield him. Down the front of his fine velvet doublet, a dark, jagged stain marked the fabric, the spiced wine he had spilled during his earlier attempt to intimidate the low-ranking clerk. In the flickering amber lantern light, the dried stain looked exactly like old, crusted blood, a permanent, undeniable mark of his public ruin. A few yards away, Lord Corin Finch tried to turn and flee into the freezing winter gardens, but a pair of guards intercepted him, slamming him roughly against the cold stone balustrade. A soldier systematically stripped the ceremonial dagger from Corin's belt, tossing the expensive, jewel-encrusted weapon onto the floor like common trash. Silas Mercer fared no better. The minor lord, who had so eagerly blocked the terrace exit to trap an innocent woman, now threw his hands up in a frantic, stammering plea for mercy. His voice cracked, a pathetic, high-pitched whine that barely registered over the ambient hum of the horrified court. The guards ignored his begging entirely, binding his wrists with heavy iron chains that clinked coldly and rhythmically against the marble. Valerius remained standing in the dead center of the silent hall, the decrypted letters still held firmly in his broad hand. He watched the systematic dismantling of the corruption that had plagued his court for years. It was not a victory won through chaotic battlefield slaughter, but through meticulous accounting, quiet endurance, and the undeniable weight of the documented law. The highest-ranking men in the kingdom were being dragged from the hall like common thieves, their grand political ambitions reduced to iron shackles and public disgrace. The room smelled heavily of melting beeswax, spilled wine, and the absolute finality of justice. No one dared speak a single word. The Alpha King had cleared the floor, just as he had promised, and every man in the room now knew exactly what it cost to cross him. When the unmarked carriage finally stopped, the iron-banded doors of the royal fortress closed with a heavy thud, severing the last tether to the Gala. Captain Hector Cole led Avery Vance through the torch-lit corridors of the keep, ascending a spiral staircase away from the public halls. Stopping before towering mahogany doors, Hector pushed them open, offered a gruff nod of respect, and retreated into the shadows. Avery stepped across the threshold. The high library of the sovereign court was a vast cavern of accumulated truth. It did not smell of lavender water or the panicked sweat of cornered men. It smelled of dry ink, aged vellum, beeswax candles, and the faint tang of pine oil used to polish the massive oak reading desks. It was the scent of absolute order. The silence here was a kind of armor, thinner than most but lighter to carry. Avery let the doors click shut. She did not collapse. She simply allowed her spine to straighten, the rigid tension of the night draining from her muscles like cold water, seeping into dry earth. The fire in the massive stone hearth had been banked to a steady ember, casting a warm amber light across rows of towering bookshelves. She moved toward the central reading desk, her velvet dress rustling in the quiet expanse. Resting precisely in the center of the polished wood lay a blank, leather-bound ledger. Avery reached out, tracing the embossed grain of the leather, pressing her thumb against the crisp edge of the parchment pages. The tactile friction grounded her. This was not a ballroom where her worth was judged by the cut of a gown. This was a sanctuary of evidence, a realm where truth was measured in meticulously recorded facts. Every breath she took felt deeper than any drawn in Julian Sterling's suffocating archives. The blank ledger beneath her hand represented something she had never possessed, a permanent, safe workspace. There would be no minor lords cornering her in the shadows here. There would only be the quiet, steady rhythm of essential labor, protected by the thickest walls in the Northern Territories. She did not know how many hours passed before the mahogany doors opened again. The fire had burned down to a soft, crackling hum. The footsteps that crossed the threshold were not the rushed paces of a guard, but the slow, deliberate tread of a man who owned the stone beneath his boots. Alpha King Valerius Kalen stepped into the amber light. He still wore the ceremonial velvet coat from the Gala, though the high collar was unfastened. He brought the scent of the freezing northern wind, ozone, and the faint metallic tang of a court that had just been violently restructured. The midwinter gala was over. The arrests had been made. The iron chains had been locked. Valerius did not rush toward her. He did not invade her space with the aggressive claiming of a victorious sovereign. He stopped on the opposite side of the reading desk, his dark eyes studying her face with a quiet, intense respect that made the breath catch softly in her throat. "The Chancellor's network is dismantled," Valerius said, his low voice carrying effortlessly through the cavernous room. "The privateer treaties have been seized. Sterling and his co-conspirators will not see the sun again." Avery nodded once, keeping her posture perfectly straight. "The ledgers will require a full audit, Your Majesty. The false entries go back 3 winters." "They will," Valerius agreed. He reached into the deep pocket of his velvet coat. He withdrew a heavy brass object and set it gently on the wood, right beside the blank leather ledger. It was the sovereign archivist seal. The base was solid brass, the handle carved from polished obsidian, the stamping plate engraved with the royal crest. It was an artifact of immense systemic power, a tool that authenticated imperial decrees and granted its bearer absolute legal immunity within the court hierarchy. The position has been vacant for a decade, Valerius continued, his gaze never leaving her face. I do not trust inherited rank, Avery. I trust competence. I trust the woman who looked at a room full of armed traitors and chose to memorize their ledgers instead of fleeing. He stepped around the edge of the desk, closing the physical distance between them. The heat radiating from his large frame was a protective barrier against the winter chill outside the glass windows. Valerius reached out, his scarred hand gently picking up the brass seal. Slowly, with a measured reverence that sent a profound ache into her chest, he placed the heavy seal directly into the center of her palm. Avery's fingers instinctively curled around the cold brass. The sheer weight of the object was staggering. It was an undeniable declaration of her value. It meant she would never again be the invisible, low-ranking translator forced to hide in the shadows. She was the sovereign archivist. No one will ever corner you in my court again, Valerius whispered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register that vibrated through the quiet room. Your workspace is secure. Your authority is absolute, and your safety. He paused, his thumb lightly brushing across the knuckles of her closed fist, a fleeting, highly controlled gesture of profound care. Dot is mine to ensure. Avery looked down at the brass seal resting in her hand, then up into the steady, respectful eyes of her monarch. Standing here in the warm, fire-lit silence of the High Library, she finally realized she no longer had to survive the court alone. The truth was securely recorded. The heavy doors were locked against the world, and for the first time, Avery Vance felt completely, permanently safe.